Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining in on this, I don't know what kind of weather it is day here in San Diego or from wherever you are. My name's Henken, and I'm delighted to be joining the Nonprofit Academy again to teach some workshops with all of you as we are all trying to figure out how we, as my title says in this, how we are learning to adapt and pivot in times of crisis. These are times that are unprecedented in how we need to learn to create change and to adapt as we move forward with literally change is the only constant right now. Next slide, please. It hasn't moved to the next slide. Thank you. I'm sure that many of you can relate to these images here. Adapting and pivoting in every aspect of our life. So I'm going to do a quick little poll, and for those of you who can pull up your chat and maybe answer just either a yes or a quick answer in it. So first of all, how many of you have attended either a virtual or Zoom, since Zoom is the standard for so many of us now, a Zoom wedding or funeral since COVID started? I'm going to give it a few seconds because I'm going to have a delayed response here. Are we getting any answers, Julian? Okay. Well, I attended two funerals in the first few weeks of COVID. My daughter was supposed to be married at a 100-person wedding in Carlsbad, California in June. We had instead had an 8-person backyard wedding and family joining us from all over the world. I don't know how many of you are, but outdoor haircuts, certainly outdoor dining. I don't have children in school. I am very grateful my children have already finished college because I don't know what I'd do if I ever had to teach my kids at home and try to work at the same time. And I'm sure that most of you are attending at least one Zoom or some other kind of conference meeting a day. And some of you are on the sitting at your desk and on conferences literally from the beginning to end of the day. So our lives are changing, and we're learning to adapt and figure it out. And the problem sometimes is we think we've figured it out, and then it changes the next day. So this is a time of complete and total changing all the time. Next slide. So this is a term that I actually came to learn about recently called VUCA. I don't know how many of you heard about it, but if you Google on it, you'll find some great articles on it. VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That is our world right now. And the nonprofit sector is perhaps buffeted by even more of that as funders either disappear, dry up as the needs of our population grow dramatically, as our ability to organize grow. So this is our everyday reality, and we need to learn to cope within VUCA. It is an incredibly stressful time for all of us, and we need to learn new tools to address how to manage during volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So volatility, changes due to COVID are taking place every day, and the biggest predictability is it's unpredictable. It happens quickly and it happens fast. A restaurant opens, one of their employees is diagnosed with COVID, they have to shut down their entire restaurant. Same thing happens in salons. Same thing happens in offices. Schools open and shut within the matter of a day or so. Uncertainty, when is it going to end? Is there a cure or vaccination? Complexity, it's affecting everything. It's affecting healthcare, business, the economy, our social life. Everything is affected. And ambiguity, because we have no known roadmap for this, no best practices. We are figuring it out as we go. As they say, we're learning to fly the plane as we build it. So I'm going to hopefully share a few basic tools with you on design thinking, tools that will help you combat VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So what is design thinking? I don't know how many of you have had any kinds of training or courses in design thinking, but it's become a big buzzword of late. It actually is something that came out of Stanford, in many ways, a Stanford D School, and some very creative people. David Kelly actually was the real founder of the concept of design thinking in his organization IDEO when they created the first Apple mouse. And they really thought about how do we think about the customer's needs and desires and how they use products and services, starting with that and moving from what are the needs, what are the problems, and then moving to a solution. as opposed to so many of us in our organizations, in the products and services we design, we start with the solution and then say, is there anybody out there who wants to use it? The theory of if you build it, they will come does not really apply for most of us. So design thinking is always about thinking about the user's needs first. The difference in design and design thinking is that design really is thinking about the individuals using it and an individual designing it. Design thinking is about working in teams. If you bring together, for example, if you are a nonprofit and you are trying to design a new solution for homeless people, you need to think about, do you have social workers involved? Do you have perhaps medical practitioners involved? Do you have, if you're thinking about new home design, do you have architects involved? Do you have funders involved? Do the actual stakeholders, the people experiencing homelessness, are they involved in the actual input to what kind of creative solution you're coming up with? And rather than thinking about products, you're thinking, how is my customer, my user, my beneficiary going to experience this? And then also, you're looking at, go back please one, sorry, Julian. Then you're looking at what is the intersection of how is the product used? Is there a real demand for it? Business, not necessarily a for-profit business, but what is the demand or sustainable use for it? And what is the human experience that is going to drive how well this is going to make a difference in how people are going to adopt it? Next slide. This is the 5 key steps. These are the 5 key steps of design thinking. And if you are not familiar with these, there are, again, endless articles, and I'm going to share some resources at the end for you to understand these 5 key steps. Today, we're going to focus really more on the first 2, maybe 3 steps: empathize, define, and ideate. Next slide, please. So in the first 2 stages, empathize and define, you are thinking about who you are solving this for. You're really looking at understanding who those people are and what their core needs are. And how do you get to that? You can't necessarily jump to, I think I know. You need to go out, get out of the building, if possible. It's a little harder today. Talk to those people. And then you need to test what your theories are. In the what, you're finding out what their needs are. You're coming up with all kinds of solutions, brainstorming on it, and then going out and testing it through prototyping and testing to make sure that your idea really works. And by the way, this isn't necessarily a circle. This could go 2 steps forward and 5 steps back. But assuming you get to the end and you've tested it and your users say, yes, this is the right solution, then you start to build it at scale, and you also start to tell stories about how this can make a difference. This is a great book I highly recommend called Lean Impact. And Ann Mei Chang was a speaker. I actually had the opportunity, for any of you who use the Classy platform, she was the speaker at the Classy Collaborative a year ago this summer when we were actually in person in Boston together. And she just so impressed me because she came from an experience being VP in engineering in, I believe it was Intel and Google. So really designing products at mass scale with a lot of funding and resources. And then went to work in innovation and impact for USAID and Mercy Corps. And her whole point in this phenomenal and easy to read and just appealing and inspiring book is do not start with the solution, fall in love with the problem and really understand that. And she talks about how nonprofits often have a hard time of really creating scale and impact because they jump to the solution before they really understand the problem. Next slide. So this is a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and then 5 minutes thinking about the solution. So think about that when you start to design your next solution. First, really understand the problem. This is a great starting point, and this is one of the first steps in the design thinking process. How do you take the user's point of view? If you can articulate that and put a real name in here, put the user's name. If it's Margaret, and Margaret is experiencing homelessness, is Margaret's problem homelessness? Is her problem unemployment? Is her problem whatever that is? Does not have skills. She needs a way to earn some income because she has to make sure that she can keep the roof over her head and not fall into homelessness. Might be a very, very simple example, but it could be Karen needs a way to get feedback from students because her class needs to become more engaging. So think about that when you start to define a problem. Take the user's point of view. The second important point is be sure you're working in teams. To the extent possible, and Zoom allows you to bring people in ways you never expected, include key stakeholders and users. In many, many design thinking programs, and we often do design thinking hackathons, which are instead of doing code, they're looking at problem solving, we'll bring in the people who are actually experiencing the problems. There have been many examples of people who are designing, for example, prosthetics. Bring in somebody who actually has a need, who has lost a limb, or who is incapacitated in some way and needs to have an artificial arm, an artificial leg, an artificial hand. How would they use it? If somebody is being involved in some kind of a social service program, bring them in and ask them to say, how would you experience in this? If you're doing grab-and-go food for people experiencing food insecurity, how will they come and get to your site to pick it up? Is that possible? Or do you have to have drivers to bring it to them because they're elderly and they don't have transportation? Think about involving the stakeholders as well as all the players, funders, program designers, program administrators, all the people who have any say in what this program is going to look like and how it's going to work when you actually roll it out. Next slide, please. So once you get some feedback, once you've worked in teams to come up with maybe more than one idea, hopefully multiple ideas, then start to prototype it. Create some really simple way to test it. It could be, if anybody's technically savvy, you do a really simple survey-based app. You can do it on paper. You can create it with a box. You can create it with simple, low-cost materials. But prototype your ideas and get feedback as many times as possible to say to people, we want your feedback. We want to know if this is going to work for you. Please give us your input and let them feel it, touch it, experience it. Next slide. So in our ideal world, we think that we'd like the design process to look like this. Step by step, one after the other. All of us know it really doesn't look like that. It looks like this. And actually, it doesn't necessarily even look like the top part. It can look like 3 huge sets of scribbles like the bottom. So first, you're going to experience, you're going to get frustrated, you're going to go round and round, and then all of a sudden, you're going to shoot out and have a positive experience. And then you're going to come back and you're going to test it, and you're going to find once again, oh my gosh, we missed a whole bunch of really important factors or insights or points of view or frustration by our users, and you're going to go back and test it again, and then you're going to go out and start to design it. But hopefully you'll keep the cost and the time low and make a lot of progress without too much lost investment at the beginning, so that by the time you actually start to design and implement the program or the project, you have a better design that actually incorporates what your users need. Next slide, please. So when you work together, it's about co-creation. Work with the communities that you're serving. Make sure you're serving their real needs. Again, design thinking is built on the idea of having a team work together. And make sure that's not a team that all come from the same point of view. It has to be people who bring different experiences and different input into it, so that you make sure you're designing something that's very real, that's relevant, and will in fact be used. In these days, we are always adapting and pivoting. I'm not very good at basketball, but if you did have to be a basketball player, you would be pivoting as the only way to successfully be able to make any baskets. So as you think about how can we embrace this need to pivot and adapt, think about what problem have you identified. Do you really understand the root cause of the problem? Do you understand what your users truly need, what your organization is faced with? And then how can you and your organization pivot to solve this? Some of you on March 15th probably thought the world was ending, and then you sort of took a deep breath and said, how do we respond and how do we start to change because our reality's changed? So some examples in the business world. Louis Vuitton, obviously high-end perfumes, high-end purses. I don't happen to have one. But they took some of their factories, their perfume factories, and they turned around and make hand sanitizer when there was a real shortage. A Los Angeles restaurant, every table, which had sort of corner restaurants, they had more grab-and-go food, and it was also a model of pay what you can and pay it forward. When their restaurant shut down, They turned around, they got some significant funding from the state and from the city of LA, and they took over a large food processing site, and they started to deliver healthy, packaged, home-cooked meals to people in need, especially people who couldn't get out to food banks or couldn't afford to buy food. And then unlikely partnerships. Whoever thought Apple and Google would work together? They are arch enemies in so many ways, and they work together to create contact tracing systems. Some other examples. I am 99% sure that nearly everybody on this call had planned for or was thinking about doing some kind of a fundraising event in person, because that's what we do. Well, we're not doing that. So as I'm sitting here in this studio, where I'm sure that the people I'm working with here are learning to work with many nonprofits and help them put on awesome events virtually, everybody's doing that everywhere. And my dear colleague on the right-hand side, who has a tux on his upper part of his body, had sneakers and shorts on the lower part of his body. My colleague there is Robert Egger, who co-founded, who is a board member originally at Kitchens for Good here in San Diego with me, and co-founded several other very large and successful social enterprises. I recently met with somebody from Canine Companions for Independence in San Diego, and they had one of the most successful fundraisers ever from doing this virtual campaign, able to reach more people and engage people in a different way. So we're all being challenged to think about new ways to do that. And then how do we repurpose resources? The San Diego Convention Center, a multi-million dollar event site, where one of my colleagues on the Kitchens for Good board actually is director of their catering service, shut down. This huge site that housed thousands of conference events every year suddenly had nobody. And yet we had a growing homeless population and people who are even more at risk and vulnerable with COVID. So the convention center, together with the city of San Diego, repurposed the convention center, put cots in and put all kinds of safety measures in, feeding solutions, and housed people who were experiencing homelessness in the convention center. Now they may be moving out and actually looking at hotel purchases. But again, it was repurposing locations. There are other situations where beautiful gardens that belong to nonprofits are being rented out for farm-to-table restaurant situations, again, with social distancing. I was hoping to attend at the Lot in La Jolla an outdoor drive-in movie night this past week with Wizard of Oz, one of my favorite movies. And it was sold out because people are anxious to get out and use space in ways that hasn't been used before. Next slide. So we go back to the same image again. What is the who you're defining for? How do you empathize with the potential users that are going to be benefiting from your solutions? And how do you define what they need? Next slide. So as we work through the design thinking process, we have to think about these questions. For whom must you solve this problem? If you can't clearly define that, if you can't give that person a name, give them a demographic, how old are they? What is their experience? Do they have children? No children? What are they specifically experiencing as issues or problems? Then you need to go and start with that point. And then what is the most pressing problem they face today? Is it lack of food? Is it lack of healthcare access? Is it the fact they don't have childcare and they need to go to a factory job or they need to go to an essential worker job? Is it whatever it is that they're facing? You need to be able to define that really clearly. And then also know, why is that such a pressing problem? Talk to them, get their input. And then before you jump to making a solution, understand, will your solution in fact make a difference for them? So how can you ensure that you're meeting the needs of your customers and clients where they are today? Most important, are they relevant and necessary? So much has changed. As we talk about Maslow's hierarchy, are people's most essential needs being met? Because if not, that's probably where you should start to make sure that you're fitting into what's relevant and necessary for them to thrive, whether it's physically or mentally. And then how can you differentiate your approach? There's a lot of confusion and disruption, a lot of frustration. How do you make sure the people that you're trying to serve know you're there? How can you make sure your funders know that you're out there making some really unique solutions to meet the needs of the clients that you have, or even perhaps expanding the client base? You need to think about these questions. One of the ways to do this is to start with empathy. And I won't be playing this video for you, but you will be receiving this PowerPoint. This is one of my favorite videos for anybody who knows Brené Brown, who does a lot of work on empathy and the difference between empathy and sympathy. So empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. It really makes people feel heard, listened to, cared for, connected. Sympathy, in this beautiful and short animation that is just, I've watched it 1,000 times and it still teaches me something, is about saying, oh, how you doing? Anything I can do for you? Don't really care. Sometimes it feels like that. So empathy is about really saying, I want to hear what you have to say. I can't necessarily directly experience what you're feeling, but I can listen and support and be there to just be a good sounding board. That's what empathy is about. Next slide. So this is an image that when I ask people to define empathy, this is one of the first things they say as a reference point, walking a mile in their shoes. You actually cannot necessarily personally experience what somebody is going through if you're not in that space. If you are a person of means and somebody is experiencing homelessness, food insecurity, mental health issues, you might not be able to directly experience that, but at least you can see what they're feeling and you can try to be as supportive, non-judgmental, and open to understanding their situation as possible. Also, it's critical to understand that people will say things very often different than what they really mean. If somebody is fearful, they may not say what they really mean, what they're really experiencing. They might say it in a way that diminishes or minimizes their real experience. So watch what they do, not what they say, because what they do really reflects their actual situation. And why do they say it? So this is one of my favorite ways to directly show the meaning of empathy for anybody who has had children, female, and born. I had a 10-pound child, so carrying around several bowling balls on my body was what I think this represents to me. And so if men can't necessarily experience directly what it feels like to have a baby, if you pack a 10-pound or 20-pound, whatever this pregnancy suit is on, at least they can feel it for a little bit. So to me, this is a humorous way to represent how do you get somebody to feel empathy. This is one way to do it. To create empathy, you really need to get outside the building. In a previous life, I would have sent students, or I serve on several boards and I started several social enterprises. I would say go out and talk to the people you're serving. It's so much harder to do that today. But you can do it by phone. You can do it by Zoom. People are in their houses. They'll pick up their phone. Ask them what they're thinking. Try to get a face-to-face if you possibly can, because facial expressions show a whole lot more than what maybe a voice will say. So if you are trying to test an idea to find out what people really need, make sure you're talking to them. Don't do it in a vacuum. Don't do it with all the people that already say, hey, I know what the answer is, because they don't necessarily know. And things have changed so much today that you really need to get a new check on reality. This is one of my favorite videos. And is it possible, Julian, to show the video? No, okay. I will tell you the story then. This is another one that you should play. So this is this remarkable young woman named Veronica Scott. And Veronica was born and raised in Detroit. She was actually the daughter of drug addicts, as she explains in this video. She was always in an extremely vulnerable situation, a family with no money, and she got an awesome scholarship to go to college. And in one of her college classes, she was given the task to design something that people really need. Now, we live in San Diego, and most people don't freeze to death on the sidewalk here in San Diego, even in our coldest winters. But certainly in Detroit, they do. So her idea was to create a coat that she could produce and give away that turned into a sleeping bag at night so that people wouldn't necessarily experience as much cold as they would without this. And she went out to test it. She went out and talked to user groups of homeless people all over the city of Detroit. And as she said, in one encounter in one discussion with one of the women that she was meeting with, this woman was, as she said, full on yelling at her, and I'm using the words of the video, saying, "We don't need coats, we need jobs." Now, coming from a family that had very little means and a very unstable housing situation herself, she could relate to that. That's one of the reasons she was focused on solutions for people experiencing homelessness. So she took back the idea of the coat to prototyping again, and she said, I want to create this coat at scale, but more importantly, I'm going to get funding to create a factory and bring in and train and employ women who are experiencing homelessness, women with families in particular, so they can have jobs and put a roof over their head and provide for their children. And that's what she did. So this is a beautiful short video that I encourage you all to watch. It brings tears to my eyes every time I watch it, because at the age of 22, she created this business. A few years later, she got enormous grants from all over the country, and she is employing now hundreds of women to produce these coats that they're both selling and giving away to groups all over the country. Next slide, please. So when we think of Veronica's situation in the empowerment plan, we need to think about how might we redesign a situation in order to create a result that might be different. So we're going to walk through this. This is one of my favorite exercises that hopefully you'll take to your teams and work with. So next slide, please. So with Veronica, we're looking at what is the problem that she's trying to solve? How might we frame it as a design question? So rather than being daunting, we have to solve homelessness in Detroit. That can't be a question. It might be, how might we redesign a certain experience in order to achieve something, and what are the possible solutions? Next slide, please. So we're going to frame this in the context of the empowerment plan and Veronica Scott. Next slide. So how might we redesign or reimagine what Veronica is doing in order to create change? Next slide. Here's how we might answer it. How might we redesign or reimagine addressing homelessness as a possible topic for women in Detroit by creating jobs and livelihoods for them to help them become financially empowered? That's one way of doing it. But phrasing it as how might we redesign, how might we reimagine, makes it a whole lot less fear-inducing, and it makes us put on our creative hat. Another way to look at it, how might we create a way to empower homeless women by creating job opportunities and livelihoods for them? The impact she's trying to have: create jobs so they can be financially self-sufficient, get off the street. Possible solutions: job training, create direct employment opportunities, partner with prospective employees, provide housing. Those are some of the ideas she had from the beginning. Certainly creating coats was one of them, but she saw that wasn't a solution, that was just part of a solution. So some of the issues that she might be facing, the women that she's working with didn't have skills. There weren't jobs necessarily that she could plug them into. Employers are unwilling to hire those people. So how can she create a solution that might address these? Next slide, please. Now I'm going to take this to an actual case study, something that is part of my heart and soul. I have been a part of Kitchens for Good on their board, and hopefully many of you know them as a very well-established and highly respected San Diego social enterprise and nonprofit. And Kitchens for Good was absolutely impacted and needed to pivot and adapt in March. Next slide, please. Kitchens for Good was founded on the principle that food changes lives. There were several components to their organization. One is culinary job training. For those who know, anybody who's justice involved and is served in prison in particular, anybody who has a criminal record, it's almost impossible to get a job. So Kitchens for Good wanted to break through that, and they started a culinary job training, teaching now over 300 individuals to become really highly skilled in the kitchen as chefs, cooks, in restaurants, in hotels, in hospitals, in a variety of organizations that were honestly lining up to hire our employees because they were our graduates, because they were so well trained. We were back again, slide please. One of the other things we did was we focused on a program for hunger relief. We did contracts with schools, with senior centers, and with food banks to create meal kits that were low cost, high nutrition food. And much of that was about also rescuing food that would have otherwise gone to waste, which is another key component of ours. But the culinary job training and the hunger relief were very core to being part of our solution. Next slide. A huge part of how our solution and impact was driven was creating a social enterprise that did catering and events. We actually hired our culinary students and graduates in this. We had and have a beautiful place at the Jacobs Center for Neighborhood Innovation on the lower right, a big event hall, which we ran hundreds of events every year. We also did corporate catering. We catered 50th anniversary parties, birthday parties in private homes. But it was over $2 million, actually almost at $2.5 million for this calendar year. And then COVID hit. Next slide, please. These were our metrics. How many students do we train? That actually is an old slide of Project Launch. Now it's over 300 people. We've created meals, we've rescued food, and we've generated enormous amounts of catering revenue. These were all of our metrics published on our annual reports right before COVID hit. Next slide, please. And then COVID changed everything. Suddenly, over $2 million of annual catering and events revenue disappeared literally overnight. We were sustainable. We had an ability to invest in our programs in really powerful ways because of all this funding and employ our students as well. Our culinary students and graduates lost their jobs. From being at 95% employment rate and remaining and in retaining their jobs, almost everyone lost their job, almost overnight. And it became really impossible to do the kind of culinary training we did in the kitchen, in a very small kitchen, in fact, and in a small classroom. Social distancing didn't allow us to do that. So talk about needing to adapt and pivot in real time. That was Kitchens for Good challenge. Next slide, please. For those of you who work in the area of hunger relief in any way, you know these stark new realities. The picture on the bottom left was in early April, over 10,000 cars lining up at the San Antonio, Texas Food Bank, an unprecedented number of people. On the right-hand side, upper right, that's actually San Diego Food Bank lines. And on the left-hand side are people waiting in line to get food. And the numbers of people who need food, who can't afford to buy food, has grown in unprecedented ways. For anybody who works with food banks or works in any kind of hunger relief, you know the numbers are astonishing and concerning. Kitchens for Good saw this. So Kitchens for Good, having worked in some small part of hunger relief, said, what do we do now? We don't have a social enterprise. We can't do catering and events. We have space. We have resources to cook. We have people trained to cook. How can we make a difference? How can we reimagine how we use our skills, our talents, and our resources to leverage those to serve what is timely and relevant and needed right now? So, this is what I ask you to ponder. As you think about how Kitchens for Good might try to reimagine their own universe, right? Before, one of the key problems was how do we generate enough revenue to be sustainable and have a very successful catering and events business. In fact, they won the San Diego Magazine Best Catering Service 2 years in a row. Suddenly that was gone. So the problem they chose to focus on is how can we do everything we can to address to address hunger relief and provide more relevant or perhaps more unfilled needs in the hunger relief arena. So here the question would be, how might we reimagine the food bank experience for people who are food insecure in order to achieve more nutrition and easier ways to feed themselves? That could be one way to do it. What Kitchens for Good was trying to do was people go to food banks, and food banks now are even more constrained than before. Their demand for their services and the food they provide is greater and greater, but their ability to secure low-cost or no-cost fresh fruits and vegetables, produce, et cetera, is even more limited. Their ability to access donations has been severely impacted as the food industry has been dramatically impaired. Supermarkets don't have the food to give away that they used to. Donors are giving in different ways. So possible solutions, and by the way, they were also trying to keep some of their people employed. They were trying to figure out a way to have an impact. But they weren't specialists in hunger relief. It was one small part of their business. They did it well, but they did it at a small scale. So how could they scale? So here the answers would be, how might Kitchens for Good reimagine the grab and go, the healthy meal experience for people experiencing food insecurity in order to increase their access to healthy eating and support the food banks. Trying to increase nutritional value, the number of fresh, healthy meals available, possible solutions, use their experience in creating healthy meals that were packaged for food, schools, for after-school programs, for senior centers. That might be one solution, working with the food banks and others. Constraints, they had a small kitchen. They did not have access to the food supplies as much. They didn't have funding in this area. Their funding was mostly from the social enterprise side where they did catering and events. So they moved forward with some creative ideas. Next slide. First thing they did, Celebration Hall, which is the large catering and event space. Huge space for anybody. I'm sure many of you have been in events and fundraisers or speaker events there. Many thousands of square feet. That wasn't being used. So they repurposed it. They put out meal assembly kit tables. They took an army of volunteers that were saying, how can we help? They took their culinary students as well as graduates, and they turned them into meal assembly and meal preparation teams. They used that space because the kitchen space was very limited. And then they also said, here in Southeast San Diego, which is where they're based, for those who know, they're down on Euclid Avenue. When the school shut down, the children that were in that school district had nowhere to go pick up meals that was easy to get to. Schools did provide for the free and reduced lunch recipients. They did provide pickup spots, but none of them were close to the Southeast San Diego area. There are also a number of low-income residents living in that area, as well as our own alumni who also are experiencing some form of financial vulnerability. So they created these grab-and-go kits that were fantastic, and drive through and pick it up. And then they started to reach out and partner with the San Diego Food Bank and Jewish Family Services. And they've ramped from 2,000 to 15,000 meals a week. So lots and lots of refocusing. I just found out today that we got an absolutely enormous grant. I can't share the news on it, but it was really exciting as I was on our board call this morning. We've received grants from many, many agencies, both within the city and county of San Diego and beyond, to start to build on this idea of creating healthy meals and essentially their meal kits. Next slide, please. We pivoted to leverage new opportunities. We have been working for now over the last year on taking over a site at the Salvation Army Door of Hope area. I believe it's in Kearny Mesa. I'm trying to remember the location, which offers us more than double the kitchen space, but also a lot more flexible kitchen space. We received a baking apprenticeship program funding from the state, so we're going to be turning that into a baking space, as well as dramatically expanding our ability to create meal kits there. And then we had to move to new ways of culinary job training. We actually just started a class anew this week, I believe, with social distancing in our current site, but that wasn't possible. From March until now, our students were locked at home. Many of them didn't have laptops. They didn't have even smartphones. We had to make sure that they had whatever tools they needed to be able to learn online. We worked with Market Box San Diego and sent meal kits to them, the fresh ingredients, and our chefs and trainers all worked with them virtually. And our first class graduated just a little while ago that were all trained, that all finished their courses virtually, and we were so proud of them. It was a really pivotal moment as we pivoted ourselves. Next slide, please. We went to new ways of virtual fundraising. We created this program called Virtual Dinners for Good. For anybody who went to our awesome Dinners for Good last year, Tommy Gomes, for example, from Catalina Seafood was one of our phenomenal hosts, as well as Sam the cooking guy. We did really fun in-person, fabulous dinners, which were with chef demos, and then our students actually made the meals. Can't do that anymore. So we went to virtual dinners for good. And every other week, we do an awesome theme. We send the recipes ahead of time, and we have a cook-along, and we've created lots and lots of new fans, new funders, and people who know about our community. So it's been really fun and a way to reach out in new ways to people that might not normally come to our events, as well as providing a connection for those who are longtime Kitchens for Good supporters, fans, funders, and advocates. So one of the most important things, as we've gone through the cycle of how do you empathize, think about what your users need, what are their real problems, how do you start to define that, how do you start to ideate, what does that look like, and then how do you test and prototype it? And believe me, we did a lot of prototyping and testing along the way. How do you train students who have never, ever really worked technologically remotely to be available and to be able to use virtual training? How do you engage audiences in a new way? How do you think about hunger relief in new ways? But then make sure you're telling your story. And that's a really, really key part of it. When somebody goes to your website, do they know that you have a coronavirus response in place? Do they know you've thought about that you're working, that you still need funding, or maybe that you need a different kind of funding or a different level? So tell your story, and tell it in numbers. That is one of the things that Kitchens for Good has always done well. It's about the numbers. How many people have you served? Partly. How many lives have you changed? If you've educated somebody, given them culinary job training, what does that translate to? It means they get a job, they get a paycheck. If you're changing the way that people eat, does it make them healthier? If you're rescuing food, does it mean less food goes to the landfill? Does it also mean that healthier food gets made available to more people? Tell your story. This is an example here on their website of how they pivoted and what are they doing now and how do you make a difference. And always, always talk about how it's making a difference. And as much as possible, do it with numbers. So, in summary, this is a representation of the 5 steps we talked about, starting with empathize and going through define, ideate, prototype, and test. First, start with empathize. Make sure you know who you're designing this for and what their real needs are, and find a way to have them tell you in person, on Zoom, on a call, in a way that they feel it's a safe and trustworthy environment to do that in. Start with that, because if you don't have that first, you will never get to the other steps, and you'll never have a product or service that is really going to make a difference or really be adopted. Next slide, please. Think about who you're solving this for. Really understand who is that person. Understand everything about their lifestyle, their personality, their constraints. What ecosystem are they part of? What does their family look like? What does their job situation look like? School, their community. How vulnerable are they or not? Who are you solving this for? Be able to put that, maybe draw a picture with a name and all of the details of their life and perhaps the details of their family, so it becomes personal and connectable. What is the most pressing problem they face today? And we all know that the problems are changing very rapidly, and many of them are becoming far more dire today than they were 5 months ago. So many people were one paycheck away from losing their home, one medical bill away from losing their home, or not being able to pay the rent, or not being able to buy food. So what has changed, and what is the most pressing problem they're facing today? Why is it pressing, and how can you start to create a solution around that? And always start with taking the user's point of view. I challenge all of you to do this as a team, to maybe break up into small teams, use Zoom, use whatever interactive tools you can, but answer this. Give an identity to one of the people that you're serving in your organization, or maybe different ones. Maybe it's a mom, maybe it's a foster youth, maybe it's a homeless person, maybe it's somebody coming to your clinic, maybe it's somebody that is in a school system and needs better access to educational tools because they live in a community where they don't have access to internet or laptops. and fill this out. Put their name on there, imagine their faces, describe what they need, and then what is a surprising insight? Why do they need this? Maybe it's surprising, maybe not, but make sure you can articulate this. And always work in teams. That is one of the things I would urge you if you take any homework away from this, besides the first little homework there to fill out. Create some interdisciplinary teams. Make sure that on your team there is somebody from different parts of your organization. Include the finance people, include the people who work in direct services, include the operations people, the marketing and funding team, the CEO. If you have an outreach team, create multidisciplinary teams and work together, because you will be surprised at how new insights come about from including more points of view and more experiences than you might typically tend to include in the way you're designing solutions. Try this exercise. This opens up possibilities. Again, when you say, how might we, it's less intimidating than say, how can we do this? How might we rethink this? How might we reimagine this? How might we create a less stressful and more open-minded way to start looking at solutions? Go out and test your ideas before you invest a lot of money. As I always say, when I worked in Silicon Valley for years and years, Google can easily afford to put $50 million into a project, and if they lose it, it's not going to destroy their bottom line. But if you're a $1 million nonprofit and you sink $50,000 into something and it's not going to be useful or not have good results, and you didn't really do this process of testing, that's a lot of money to lose, and your funders probably won't be happy either. Or if you're a multi-million dollar nonprofit, $100,000 loss is still huge. Do things at low cost, low time frame in terms of getting them done, go out and test them, and keep on doing feedback loops, especially with these teams that I mentioned. These are some great free resources, and by the way, I do believe that you will have my contact information from this webinar. I'm always happy to interact with any organizations in San Diego and share some of the tools I use, resources, chat with you, but these are fantastic and no-cost tools. IDEO.org is a great organization that does a huge amount of training in design thinking, and they have a whole bunch of free resources on Design Kit, and if you Google a little more, you can often find videos to show you how to use them most effectively. They also have a field guide to human-centered design. All of these are just fabulous tools that really work well, and again, are free, and maybe is something sort of expanding the way that you look at problem solving with your teams. Next slide. Another online free resource from the D School. That is where I had the honor of going and learning some really in-depth design thinking tools at Stanford. They make a huge number of free resources available. And then Acumen, if you Google on design thinking courses, I know Coursera has many of them as well. Acumen has some great team-based human-centered design courses as well. That might be a good way to get your team involved. And since all of us are on computers, it's just another way to get people involved in creative ways. Thank you for listening to this topic, and I'm open to any questions. Should we give another? You all have my email here as well. If you're not putting anything in the chat, feel free to note my email and send a question or comment, concern, agree or disagree on some of these things that I have shared with you today, but hopefully you'll find them useful. And your homework assignment is to take some of the tools I gave to you and bring them to your teams and see if you can make them think of new ways to solve problems. Thank you so much.